Amazing. We are live. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a quick break. Really excited for this next talk. We've been talking about Figma quite a bit. Of course, again, really thankful for them for helping us put together the entire programming for the event. And so one thing that most of us, again, designers are usually curious about is what is the design process behind the design tool, that everyone's raving about. So really excited to have Noah Levin today joining us. Noah is the design director at Figma. Previously, he was, at companies like ClassPass, Google, Framer, and NASA. Really, really stoked to have you here, Noah. Thank you for joining us. Really excited for your talk.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks a lot, Preet, and I'm excited to chat with all of you all and show you a little bit of behind the scenes on what we do and how we work at Figma. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and let me know if this works. Here we go, one sec. All right. Are you able to see me okay? All right, cool. So I prepared about like 15 minutes or so of content, and then I wanna make sure that I can leave some time for questions that people have, just so we can kind of dive in and have more specific conversation around that. So Preet already introduced me really well, and just for some context, I've worked at a bunch of companies over the last 10 years and been super excited to be a part of Figma the last 2.5 years. I joined Figma, we were about 30 people, and now we're about 180 people. So it's kind of wild to see the product evolve, the company evolve, and it's been quite a ride, and I feel really lucky to be a part of it. Before we jump in, one of the questions we were asked as speakers is, what are we doing during this time to kind of stay sane, or like, what does our routine look like? So just like a couple of little things, spending some time with family where I can over FaceTime. This clip with my grandma was from this morning, where I was able to finally get her on FaceTime for the first time, which was really exciting for me. And holding tightly to family during a time like this is really a really nice thing to do. I've been lucky enough, I live in San Francisco, to have beautiful parks nearby. So I've been trying to like get outside as much as possible, playing some music. Internally at Figma, we're like working on this like side project musical thing, which is kind of funny. And then of course, like everyone else, probably a lot of Netflix. And also I just discovered Minecraft, which has been quite addictive. So some context on my role and our team, and so you can kind of understand the process that I'm going to go over here. My role as director of design at Figma focuses on the product, but focuses on all kinds of things to create a healthy environment for product designers. And so we are a team of 10 product designers, and a lot of my time is focused on making sure that they feel like they have a safe environment, giving them good feedback as much as I can, and creating things like the process I'm about to show you to make sure that we have a healthy environment for design generally. I also spend some time with our community as much as I can, and with customers directly. I feel really lucky to get to meet with so many different kinds of companies working in design. And then, of course, continuing to grow the team. So this is what our team looks like these days, of course, spending time together on Zoom. And these are the projects that that people tend to focus on. We tend to split into specific areas: creation, collaboration, community, and monetization are our 4 areas. And each of these designers represent ownership of some subset within them. And so it's been really fun to try to like figure out how to adapt together and make sure that we're able to like continue to be productive, but at the same time recognize that we're not going to be as productive in a time like this. We had a Photoshop competition of like where we might be when things settle down. We're like, maybe we'll go to Mars. I don't know. We'll figure it out. So this is a team of what it might look like if we were together someday again. But the process I'm going to show you, interestingly enough, isn't that different from what it used to be before for us. We've definitely made some adjustments and some changes, which I'm going to go over, but generally this is what our week looks like. And I'm going to go over what each of these specific times are. And just to be clear, this is going to be about our design teams process together. It's not going to be about how the product teams individually work. So of course there are these pillars and trios of a design lead, a PM lead, and an eng lead, like most of you are probably familiar with. And this isn't really about how those teams work regularly to move forward on their projects on like a vertical area. This is more about the horizontal design team and how we work together, how we collaborate to make the product better. So really quick, one thing that we noticed not having something like hallway conversations that we used to have in person, we used to just be able to like have a conversation about anything or keep something light. And now it's like, you don't want your time over these screens to always feel like it's always about a project specifically. Like it's important to get to know each other. We spend so much time at work. And so we kind of set up these optional meetings in the morning. And sometimes no one shows up, sometimes a couple of people do. It's totally whatever people are comfortable with and can attend. We just put on some jazz. It turns out Zoom allows you to like stream music, which was kind of fun to figure out. And so we made a little playlist together and just kind of goof off. This is Heather, one of our designers, showing her mug collection, just something to like kind of start the day on something kind of light and interesting. The first thing we do together throughout the week is this is kind of a critical meeting that we call warm up in the beginning of the week. This is on Monday. It starts in the morning at 9:30. And what we do is we spend this time in the way beginning. We might just recap our weekend just to kind of start with something light. We start to go into some highlights of the week before. And in doing that, by the way, like we used to just go physically around the room and be like, all right, just go around. And now you can't do that with Zoom. Like you actually have different arrangements per person. So we actually just encourage each person to like pick the next person that goes after them. I'm sure a lot of you have figured out the same trick as a way to kind of facilitate a group conversation. But that's something we've learned to do. And what we do is we have a Notion doc that organizes the content for each of the warm-ups. This is what that doc looks like. And within it, we start again with those updates. We jump into highlights from the week before, just celebrating key moments and wins. And then probably the most critical utility part of the meeting is we actually schedule the critiques for the week. And we're going to talk about critiques in a bit. But this is a moment where we actually plan who's going to talk about what ahead of time, which makes it helpful for people to feel accountable for the things that they want to share. This makes it a lot easier for them to plan what's going on, to invite guests if they want to. And it also just gives everyone a bit of a sense of what people are focused on for the week. And so that Monday morning warm up is a really helpful time to plan for the week, to know what's coming, and to schedule the times that we have together as a team. We also, of course, like update the calendar events so that they don't just say critique, but we actually include the topics of the critique so that you can kind of prepare or know if they are kind of optional, although most of the time pretty much everyone goes, but you can choose, oh, that topic isn't really relevant to me and I have something else I need to do, and that's totally fine. And this lets people plan more easily. We have a critique channel in Slack, of course, which we use for asynchronous critiques as well, but we also highlight the schedule ahead of time there whenever we can. On Mondays, at the end of the day, we have a team meeting, and this is at 4 o'clock, and it's a time for us to talk about like team OKRs as a design team. What are the things as a team that we want to improve on, that we think we could be doing better? And so, this week, for example, we actually talked more about critiques in a time like this and how we can continue to iterate on them. They don't always happen. Sometimes we cancel it if there's no agenda. That's totally fine. So I would say like maybe 3 of them a month kind of end up happening. We might spend time sourcing if we're looking for new designers, going over what our expectations are in something like a career ladder, our design principles, anything that is outside of something you would take to a critique like a project. And so this is an example from a few weeks ago, where we were also just sort of thinking about how to adapt as a team during a time like this and really be intentional about how to adjust our processes. At the end of the week, I'm jumping past critiques because that's probably the bulk of a lot of what I want to talk about. But at the end of the week, we have something called cool down. So like if you have a warm up at the beginning of the week, cool down is at the end of the week. And this is a chance for us to honestly just like learn something new, maybe play a game together, share some kind of highlights on how, maybe share how we're feeling, build something together. This can look like all kinds of things. A recent one we did, and we sort of expanded this to include our research team as well, was just sort of like having a chance to check in on how people are doing, but then also games. So like this is a game where you kind of, maybe you're drawing animals in 5 seconds, and it's just kind of funny and quirky and quick. Maybe something like Telephone, if you've ever played like a Pictionary version of Telephone, where you have to figure out what the drawing was, you give it a name, and then the next person doesn't have the drawing, they have to draw something else based on that name, and it becomes something interesting over time. We've played a game where we tried to draw silhouettes of each other, where like your pencil tool is down and then you don't release it until until you're done. So like you kind of can't, it's like kind of more of a contour drawing. You can't really do a whole lot. I mean, it kind of puts everyone on the same playing field, which is really fun. Most recently, we actually started making a board game together. So we jumped in. It actually only took us like an hour and a half, which was pretty fun. And we started kind of basically riffing off of Mario Party and using our custom cursors that we had done, if you had seen that over April Fool's Day, and using those as like little board games. There's a plugin for Figma that you can roll a dice. And so we've been using that to try to simulate the feeling of going through something. So that was just, I don't know, just kind of fun stuff. As a part of these, to plan for all of these meetings we're talking about, the warm-up helps in the beginning of the week, but also we have this document we call the queue. And this document exists in Notion, and anyone can add to it throughout the course of the week. And this allows us to stack up topics that come up throughout the week. So, oh, this one would fit as a team meeting. This one would fit as a cool down. This would fit as a critique, whatever it is. People sometimes go throughout the week and update this over time. So it's just helpful so we don't lose track. So critiques are probably the bulk of the time we spend. I've talked about some of the lighter moments, the fun moments culturally that we spend as a team. Critiques are like honestly a time for us to really improve each other as designers and improve the work more specifically. And so I wanted to spend like the bulk of this talk kind of going into how that works, because it's something we've been iterating on quite a bit over the years. The driving philosophy behind this is that like we think critiques are one of those things that can be kind of intimidating for a lot of people. They can be uncomfortable, they can be scary. But instead, ideally, if done well, they should actually feel like motivating. They should feel like something you want to go to, something that you find helpful, and something that maybe like isn't so scary, but instead like, oh my God, I get this privilege to work with these incredible people and they get to improve the work that I'm doing. So I think ideally that's the feeling that you have. When we first started looking at how to improve these, we had a lot of issues. Like there were too many people in them. The feedback people were getting was a little shallow. The problems in some cases were so complex that how are you supposed to actually get the depth of feedback you want, because you're spending half the time just explaining it. A lot of you might be familiar with these kinds of challenges. And of course, we can't always solve all of them, but we do our best to try to improve each of these cases when they come up. So a lot of times what we do is we go into Figma to have like retrospectives or to have conversations about what we want to improve. And so we kind of sat down and kind of organized our thoughts around what wasn't going well, what we think we could be doing better. We also wanted to make sure this was an ongoing conversation. So we created a Slack channel called Design Crit, which is a moment for us to actually look at the process over time and not just this one point in time. And so if someone has an idea, they can just throw it in there whenever they want. Overall, we agreed on these goals. The goals for them should be that it helps to unblock you if you feel stuck. That would be like a great outcome. If you're stuck on a problem and by the end of the critique, you feel like you're unstuck, that's great. It should be to elevate quality. So this is something that should help from anything from visual design to interaction details or even overall product direction. It should be for encouraging consistency. So we have this luxury as a design team of seeing all the projects that happen. And so if we can catch moments that might be hard for an engineer or a PM to catch if they're focused on one project, we should be able to flag those to make sure people don't get inconsistent experiences. And then of course to share context. There might be a project someone's working on that affects someone else. And so we want to make sure that people can catch those when they happen. It's very important to us that critiques remain a safe space for feedback. And to do that, we made the decision early on that they should not be a meeting where you're making decisions, where you're making really critical product decisions. That just that means inherently you're going to have way too many stakeholders in that room potentially. It means that like all of a sudden the shape of the meeting becomes a lot less like a jam session and more like a formal presentation. And we really wanted to avoid that. We wanted these moments to be times together where you're jamming on something, where you really have the chance to actually jump in and improve the work you're doing and not be so stressed about, will this be approved? Will that be approved? And at the end of the day, the decisions aren't left to like horizontally all the design team. It's up to the individual designer and the PM and the tech lead. That's the trio that we trust to make the overall decisions. And this is a meeting where we elevate the quality of their work by giving them as much input as we can to make sure that can stay the case. And there might be some small exceptions where maybe like we have to like overrule something, but honestly, it doesn't really happen very often. We really have a lot of trust that we hope that enables people to sort of be able to make the decisions they need to make, armed with all the feedback that they can. With all that in mind, we created a framework of these 6 different feedback types that allow us to choose what kind of feedback we're looking for and pick a method that matches to that feedback. And so, you easily can get in the habit of just having one type of critique and everyone keeps doing it. But it turns out there's a lot of different ways to get feedback. And depending on what you're working on, you can imagine presenting something slightly differently. We actually have a blog post that goes into a lot of detail about this. And I'm just going to kind of cover the high level of each of them so we can make sure to also save time for questions. So generally speaking, there's a standard kind of critique that you're probably used to. And this might be when you kind of need people to understand some context. You have to give it some forethought in the beginning of how to share that context. After you explain it, we always say, hey, does anyone have clarifying questions? Before just jumping into feedback, which can get kind of messy pretty quickly, we want to make sure that if someone is confused, it's likely someone else is confused. So we take an intentional period of time to like clarify any questions people have that is not about giving feedback yet. Once everyone agrees that we understand it, then we start giving feedback. And in doing that, we can either do it by going around the room, and that's actually helpful so that if people don't feel comfortable speaking up, they have a chance to be heard, so you can actually go around the room. But in some cases, if we don't have time for that, we might say, okay, we're going to do popcorn. And popcorn sort of means it's going to kind of come up at different times. Each person can bring up whatever they need whenever they want. We try to avoid that method because it does tend to lean on people who feel most comfortable speaking loudly. But at the same time, for short periods of time, sometimes you have to do it. Jams are our favorite. This is something that hopefully you've even had the chance to do today. I know we had a Figma workshop earlier for people. This is something where you can jump in together and actually work on a problem. And it turns out you'd think, okay, maybe you can only do this in pairs, but actually like you'd be surprised at how much design work can be done as a team when you have the chance to jump into a file together. And so jams and workshops are another method. And someone can say, even at the beginning of a project, all right, like fresh slate, what do we want to try? Just to kind of get some early ideas in there. And so this is some examples of us doing that. Back when we were in person more, we still try to find ways of doing co-piloting is what we call this, pair design, the chance for people to partner together. In person, it might happen more organically because you're sitting near each other, but remotely we try to carve out more intentional times. So we try to assign for any given project a co-pilot to help them. They're not accountable for the project, but they're available to help. That way, if you have 10 people all sharing feedback at the same time, all sharing projects, you don't know which one to give feedback to. You could always be like, well, I'm the co-pilot for this one, so I'll prioritize giving feedback on this. Almost done here. On silent critiques, this is what we use the most often, I would say, these days especially. And this is kind of surprising at first for people who haven't tried it. The idea of kind of almost like a silent meeting. It's like, what's the point of in a way? But actually, what happens is the depth of feedback you get when you jump into a Figma file and you have everyone leave comments as sort of sticky notes. And we have templates for this that are on our community you can find. Is that you end up having multiple tracks of conversations at once, rather than just like the loudest person in the room. And this becomes incredibly helpful for getting depth from a large group. If you're only dealing with 2 people, honestly, you should just be talking in most cases. I think it could work fine. But in a larger group, this ends up being super, super helpful. This is an example from this morning. I just grabbed a quick screenshot from something we were working on. And so you can see that like we're on the Zoom, but like our heads are probably down, you know, and we're focused on mostly providing these threads of conversations happening through comments. And so that ends up being the most frequent form of feedback, but we want to be careful to not overlean on them in case it means that we're dodging important decisions or questions that are coming up. So we have to kind of keep it in balance and keep it in check and encourage us to step back toward the end of the meeting and say, all right, which of these topics really had a lot of meat to it that we really should be talking about. So we try to kind of mix and match a little bit when we can. We used to print out things sometimes. We can't do that anymore. We also have FYIs where you're just like, hey, heads up, I just need 2 minutes to share some context with people, and that's all right. So again, the goal is match the method you have to the problem that you're focused on. And again, all of these should still be relevant whether or not we're in a remote environment or not. We also, because as a company, we work to help people learn about design. The more people that are part of the design process, you know, we think the healthier that can be over time. And so we feel this urge to encourage and teach design both externally and also internally. And a way to do that, one way we do that is we have this guide for visitors and we invite visitors into our critiques. When we were in physical rooms, this was actually harder because the room felt crowded. But with Zoom, to be honest with you, it hasn't felt bad. In fact, when I'm giving this talk, I have no idea how many of you there are right now. And so it's like, it's a little bit, in some ways, if you don't notice the pressure of size. And so that means that we can actually invite guests where they're silent the whole time, but all of a sudden they learn so much about how designers work, about the conversations they have. This has been super, super helpful for us. And every single employee at Figma has to come to a critique when they join at some point in time so that they can gain some of this knowledge. We try to reinforce the good ones. So these are critiques that we think have gone particularly well, and we keep a list of them. That way people can reference them over time. We try to keep notes and we rotate note takers to avoid things like gender bias, where maybe unfortunately some people get asked to do it more than others. We actually rotate intentionally. We try to keep time. When we were in physical rooms, we tried to use smaller ones so it didn't feel as scary like a boardroom. And we also try to make sure that feedback is done in a way that is fair. And so there's more on this that we're going to write about at some point as well. So again, this is our week. This is what it looks like. I spent most of the time talking about critiques because that's really the bulk of where work happens together. And I think it's particularly important to highlight. There's still some challenges. There's still some stuff we're working on. You know, sometimes there are too many people and it's hard to get feedback. Sometimes there's too many topics that we can't fit it all in a week. This is literally from yesterday where we spent some time trying to debug like how to improve them over time. So again, we're always iterating and we're always improving. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'd love to spend however much time we have left to answer any questions you have at all. And I'm actually writing a blog post about all this that should go out by the end of next week. And so if this was too fast or too much, hopefully you'll just be able to catch it online next week as well when we post the article with all this in it.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was amazing and extremely informative. I think much like the whole ethos on which Figma as a tool is built, it's like the same ethos in your talk, which was like giving it all away. It's like, this is how we do everything. So thank you so much for that. We do have questions and I think even some feature requests, which I'm sure, I'm sure your team gets often, and fun feature requests. So Han here And I think I upvote her request, which is like, if enough folks write into support, can we bring the custom curses forever? Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, we were super nervous about that. Like there was a lot of risk in doing an April Fool's thing in a time like
Right.
this. Honestly, like we feel really lucky that our customers found it to be as exciting and helpful or like fun as you did. And we have no plans to bring it into the product, but the code exists, the images exist, and so who knows?
Yeah. Amazing. Oh, yeah. The most upvoted question we have is from Elise. The question is, at what stage did you start to introduce these practices? Elise is sharing that they are currently a group of 3 designers. And so what were you doing at a similar stage?
Yeah. So interestingly, part of my interview process 2.5 years ago, when I looked at Figma, and there were about 3 designers at the time, was actually to facilitate a critique and to come and help them do this. And so from the get-go, this was something that I think there was interest in. And so that maybe helped us a little bit. And they had already been doing basic critiques without necessarily any process to it, but just like having the time together. Critiques when you're at a really small stage of a company are slightly different because you tend to have more people that aren't designers in different cases. And as you grow, that tends to adapt and change. So I would say we've been doing it certainly since the day that I joined, but also, as you've seen in some of the later slides, like we're constantly iterating on it. And so we're revisiting it frequently. And we're even talking about, can we even rotate ownership so that it stays fresh? Like, can we have a designer that's super interested in them, like own it for like a quarter? And so we're constantly talking about ways to keep doing it.
That's really amazing. Then we have a few other questions. One question is, how do you approach, by Susanna? The question is, how do you approach a larger conversation from a bigger problem? Example, a brainstorm, like do you have a schedule ad hoc meeting with everyone or in pairs? I think a little open-ended question.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, how do you handle complex conversations with a group of 10 people or 9 people, and what are the right spaces for them? And ideally, those can really happen at the most level of depth with the core working team, right? Like you want your product manager, your eng lead, and your design lead, like having those conversations as much as possible. I think one thing we've learned is trying to expand the meeting to be an hour instead of a half hour for a single topic. Typically we do 2 topics in an hour, so a half hour each, but we've really quickly learned 30 minutes can go by very fast. And so definitely try to expand it. We always recommend having more time for in-depth discussion. We've tried to do pre-reads when we can. So like send a link out the day before, see if people can read it. All kinds of stuff like that can help. Asynchronous, so like reading things even just before critiques or whenever generally, and like giving feedback through them in that way. I mean, there's a lot of tricks, and I'd say we haven't perfected it, but just as long as the conversations are happening and they're not being avoided, then hopefully you're in good shape.
Right. Kind of almost like a little follow-up or conjunctional question by Anthony, which is, do you have an official review process? So more centered around design approval after or in conjunction with the critiques?
Yeah, great question. We do. We actually have something we call product review, and this is something that we started when Yuki, our VP of product, joined about a year ago. And there are 2 types of product reviews. There's a problem alignment, which is the early stage where you're agreeing on what the problem is you're trying to solve. Super important meeting, super important time to make sure people, like before they get too far in a solution, are actually aligned on what they're working on. And people involved in that would be myself, Yuki, our VP of engineering, Chris, and Dylan, our founder. And so, and then of course the working team. And so those are core decision-making meetings. So I mentioned earlier in the talk that like critiques are not supposed to be that. That's because product reviews are. And teams take it to those reviews when they are ready at the right time. So there's not like a forced cadence, but they take a problem review when they're ready, and they go to a solution review, which is the end, kind of like a design review you could imagine, a more formal one, where they're showing the proposal and then people have a chance to give feedback. So we definitely have those reviews. For really small projects, they might happen asynchronously. Like we have a product review channel in Slack, and we might just send like, hey, here's the doc, read through it. It's a quick change. What do you think? But for bigger topics, we definitely carve a whole hour out for that one topic for that team.
Love it. I hope many of the companies that I worked in the past did have a problem review sessions in place or practice. Definitely, I think that could save a lot of designers late nights being spent or products totally being redesigned in the critiques just because there's misalignment around the problem itself. We have one question by Shafali, which is a little more sync to our whole theme of remote collaboration. So do you have any additional thoughts to share on good asynchronous critique practices? The team is split across time zones, which always makes it tough to have that time together.
Yeah, great question. I'd say a few things. We actually have one remote designer, Nico, who's based in Germany. And so we had some practice with him earlier on. And some things we do is definitely having a note taker so that they can review the feedback people had is really helpful. It sucks because the note taker often has to be pulled out of the meeting almost. They can't really be present. So that's why we rotate it over time. I would say that having organized Figma files, if you are using Figma, and having a place where you can say like in big letters, like, here's where I want feedback and on what, and let people use that as the mechanism. So like basically the better you set up your files and your kind of like problem statement, the easier you're going to have of getting like really good, rich feedback. And so I definitely think like it takes a bit of planning, unfortunately, and not everyone is ready to do that. And that's totally fair. You got a lot of stuff going on. But if you can just spend the extra 5 or 10 minutes being critical about, all right, they're going to be looking at this. They might not have this context. Like, how can I tell the story quickly? Maybe how can I like point them to specific areas if they don't have time to look at all of it? And then also, I would say as a principle, default to open. And what I mean by that is if there's a conversation that you are having and it's like maybe one-on-one in Slack, and it feels like the kind of thing that might be helpful for other people to have, I think in a remote world, it's really, really important, because in the real world, maybe if you're just having that conversation in the hallway, again, someone can hear it, so they can jump in, be like, me too, like we can talk about that. In a remote world, that doesn't happen. And so you have to default to open more often and try to share the feedback you have in public spaces to encourage that kind of dialogue.
Right. Amazing. Thank you so much, Noah. That was really amazing. I'm sure, usually how you're watching YouTube videos or talks, you watch at 2x speed. I think it's going to be the opposite in your case. People are going to be watching it at half the speed because there was so much amazing content shared. I'm like, there are a few other questions, some that you had covered in your talk. Is it okay for folks to still share questions in the Slack channel?
Yeah, I'll be in the Slack channel. I've got meetings starting in about 10 or 15 minutes, so I'm not going to be there instantly, yes, but I can take a look after. So definitely like leave notes in there, and I'm in the Slack, so I'll catch you in there.
Amazing. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. This was an amazing talk.
Thank you. Great. Awesome.
Have a good one.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, that was a really amazing talk. We have one last talk left. Let me share my screen quickly. So we have one last talk of the day, but before that, what is happening after the talk? Today, we are not jumping into social right after our next talk. We have a musical performance. So really excited to welcome our friend Michael Wexler from Montreal, who will be performing for about 30 minutes, close to 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, right after the next session. So let's take a quick break, about 5 minutes. Really exciting talk by Mrinali and Juliana around how do you push boundaries with design around tech that you don't get. Really excited for this. See you in 5 minutes. Bye.